That practice clip was the first sign something was seriously off. Chris Paul kept pushing his ideas. Harden tried passing one to Ty Lue, and Lue immediately shut it down. With the team already 5-16 and tensions rising, that moment exposed just how bad things had gotten. And now, Harden finally explains why. The breaking point. What happens when a legendary point guard's leadership style crashes headfirst with a championship coach's power? When does being responsible cross the line into causing trouble? And what role did James Harden play in showing one of the most dramatic locker room explosions in recent NBA history? The answers to these questions paint a picture of a messed-up organization, clashing egos, and a team falling apart during the 2025-26 season. The LA Clippers entered this season hoping to win a championship, but instead they've become the center of one of the most controversial player-coach breakups we've seen in years. At the heart of this storm stands Chris Paul, the 19-year veteran whose loud leadership has both lifted teams and caused problems all through his amazing career. But what happened between Paul, head coach Ty Lue, and the Clippers organization goes much deeper than your usual basketball argument. This is a story about power, respect, communication falling apart, and finally, a veteran superstar being sent home in the middle of the night during a road trip. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to July 2025, when Chris Paul signed a one-year veteran minimum contract with the Clippers, coming back to the team where he'd previously spent 6 seasons. The signing was celebrated as a homecoming, with Paul placed as a teacher figure and, as many sources said, an extra part of the coaching staff. The Clippers were counting on Paul's basketball smarts and championship experience to lead a roster featuring older stars James Harden and Kawhi Leonard, along with new players like Bradley Beal, Brook Lopez, and John Collins. The plan seemed perfect on paper. A veteran point guard who could lead by example, hold players responsible, and serve as a link between the coaching staff and the locker room. Paul had done this well in other places, most recently teaching young stars like Shai Gilgeous-Alexander in Oklahoma City. But from the very start of the 2025-26 season, something felt wrong. The Clippers started badly, and as losses piled up, so did the tensions building underneath. The team's 5-16 start showed far more than just poor basketball play. It showed basic problems with how the team was built, injury handling, and maybe, most importantly, a breakdown in how the organization talked and led. Bradley Beal had season-ending surgery before the season really began. Kawhi Leonard, fighting a sprained ankle, managed to play in only 11 of the team's first 22 games. The weight fell more and more on James Harden's 37-year-old shoulders, forced to carry a load that was too heavy night after night as the team's older veteran group struggled to stay healthy and competitive. Into this very tense situation stepped Chris Paul, whose reputation as one of the NBA's most demanding leaders is well known. Charles Barkley has famously called Paul the best leader of this generation for 15 years. And it's not by accident. Paul doesn't just show up and get paid. He studies game film all the time, takes lots of notes, holds teammates responsible, and isn't afraid to question authority when he thinks something isn't working. As Devin Booker once said, understanding Paul's intensity, Chris isn't for everybody. And that's exactly what the Clippers were about to find out. The first major problem came during a loss to the Dallas Mavericks in November 2025. Paul told Kawhi Leonard to switch off guarding Klay Thompson, pointing to Leonard's minutes limit and his clear struggles on that specific defensive job. To Paul, this was just smart basketball, seeing a bad matchup and making a change right then. To the coaching staff, however, it meant something much more worrying: a player going beyond his role and weakening their power. The situation got much worse on the team plane after the game. Assistant coach Jeff Van Gundy confronted Paul about changing defensive plans without asking the staff. The talk got angry, with Van Gundy telling Paul directly, "You might have had freedom in other places, but you don't have that freedom here." It was a clear line being drawn. The coaching staff showing their power over a veteran player who they felt was acting more like a coach than a teammate. Paul's response was typically bold and public. He went to Instagram and posted a picture showing the dictionary meaning of the word leeway. A not-so-subtle shot at Van Gundy and the coaching staff. The message was clear. Paul wasn't giving up, and he wanted everyone to know that he felt he'd earned the right to have a say on basketball choices after 19 years in the league. But it was what happened behind closed doors, especially during practice sessions, that would finally decide Paul's future with the organization. And this is where James Harden comes into the picture, in a role that would accidentally show how deep the problems were. During an early October 2025 practice, Chris Paul suggested a more organized offensive play to James Harden. The details of the play aren't as important as what happened next. Harden, seeming to try to be helpful, went to Ty Lue with Paul's suggestion. What happened in that moment would become one of the most talked about events of the whole story. Ty Lue's response was strong and dismissive. "This is what we're doing. Forget CP. There's no name for it." The message couldn't have been clearer. Lue was running his offense his way, and Chris Paul's ideas were neither wanted nor needed. The plays weren't going to be changed for or depend on Paul's suggestions, no matter his Hall of Fame history. But the story doesn't end there. A hot microphone also caught James Harden repeating this feeling to Lue, saying, "CP ain't got no name on it. Just get the ball, play, and get the action." To many watchers, this moment showed Harden putting himself on the side of the coaching staff, and, whether on purpose or not, showing Paul's seen as too much involvement in team matters that went beyond his role as a backup point guard who played limited minutes. The way it looked was terrible. Here was the current MVP candidate, James Harden, basically agreeing with the coach's rejection of Paul's basketball ideas. For a player whose whole identity is about being a floor leader and basketball genius, this public putdown hurt deeply. Paul was averaging just 3.9 points and 3.3 assists in 14.3 minutes per game over 16 games. His on-court role had already been made very small. Now, his off-court influence was being rejected just as strongly. According to many reports, tensions between Ty Lue and Chris Paul grew to a point where they were not talking for several weeks, limited only to needed on-court talks. Paul reportedly asked for many meetings with Lue to talk about the worsening situation. But those requests were ignored. The silent treatment, whether you call it that or something else, was fully happening, and the whole locker room could feel the tension. Former NBA champion and analyst Kendrick Perkins would later tell on his podcast that this wasn't just about one or two events. According to Perkins, who had inside knowledge from talking with former teammates of Paul's, he was doing stuff behind Ty Lue's back, going to players, whispering, saying things, and causing trouble when the team is already struggling. Perkins painted a picture of a player who wasn't just offering suggestions, but actively working against the coaching staff's power by disagreeing with their instructions during timeouts and whispering different plans to younger players. The situation reached a breaking point during a Tuesday film session in late November 2025. The Clippers staff and players grew tired and were at the end of their patience with Paul's constant locker room lawyering. According to reports, his criticisms of management, coaches, and players, given in his typically direct and unfiltered style, were seen as annoying and disruptive rather than helpful. For an organization already dealing with growing losses, injuries, and questions about their championship chances, Paul's loud demands for responsibility were the last straw. The 3 a.m. meeting. The Clippers were in Atlanta on December 3, 2025, for a road game when everything came to a head. What should have been a normal business trip turned into one of the most shocking and sudden player separations in recent NBA memory. The scene was set for a fight that had been building for weeks, if not months. And when it finally happened, it would leave players, coaches, and fans alike trying to understand what had just happened. Team president Lawrence Frank had flown to Atlanta specifically to meet with Chris Paul. The meeting, originally planned for earlier in the evening, was delayed by plane problems, pushing it back to the early morning hours. At about 3 a.m. in a hotel room far from home, Frank delivered the news that would end Paul's second time with the Clippers. He was being let go, effective immediately. Paul went to Instagram shortly after posting, "Just found out I'm being sent home. Peace." The shortness of the message hid the emotional weight of the moment. A 19-year veteran, a future Hall of Famer, a player who had given everything to the game he loved, was being sent home in the middle of a season on a one-way ticket back to Los Angeles. The Clippers, sitting at a terrible 5-16 record, had made their decision. Chris Paul's presence, no matter his intentions, was doing more harm than good. The meeting itself was reportedly emotional and full of argument. Frank later described it to ESPN, saying this decision had nothing to do with one single event. It just wasn't the right fit. He was firm that the organization wasn't blaming Paul for their terrible start, stating strongly, "I'm not putting that on Chris Paul at all. This is not a situation where I'm using Chris as an excuse." Frank admitted that the team was playing bad basketball on all fronts and that organizational failures went from the top down, starting with him. But if the organization wasn't blaming Paul for the losses, what exactly had gone so wrong that they felt they had to send him home in the middle of the night? The answer, it seems, lies in the basic mismatch between Paul's leadership beliefs and the culture the Clippers were either trying to build or, more cynically, trying to avoid facing. According to league sources talking to various media, Paul's leadership style crashed dramatically with the Clippers' organizational way. His direct, confrontational method of holding everyone responsible, from management to coaches to star players, created what the organization saw as a poisonous atmosphere. But here's where the story gets complicated and opinions split sharply. Was Paul creating negativity in a locker room that was working before? Or was he just showing and trying to fix problems that already existed? Social media talks and online forums exploded with debates about this very question. Many watchers pointed out that a 5-16 team being angry at a player for demanding better effort was exactly why they were 5-16 in the first place. As one user smartly noted, the Clippers seemed to have a culture problem where being responsible was seen as dividing rather than needed. If your best players are coasting through games, if your coaching staff isn't making good changes, If your management is making questionable roster choices, shouldn't someone speak up? Paul's supporters argue that this is exactly what the organization needed, a voice willing to tell hard truths and demand excellence. His critics say that there's a way to give that message without pushing away everyone around you, and that Paul's way crossed lines many times. The truth, as it often does, likely exists somewhere in the middle of these competing stories. Ty Lue talked to the media in the days after Paul was let go, and his comments showed the complexity of the situation. In a December 9, 2025 interview, Lue firmly denied the silent treatment claims, saying, "That ain't true. We were talking. He played. How he gonna play if I'm not talking to him?" Lue admitted that there was a hard period when Paul was benched and out of the playing rotation. There was a stretch when he wasn't going to play and be out of the rotation. It was tough for him, because he's a competitor. But Lue maintained that communication never completely stopped, even as he admitted the relationship had become impossible to save. Perhaps most tellingly, when asked about the decision to let Paul go and whether it would help the team moving forward, Lue's honesty here is striking. He's basically admitting that removing Paul from the roster wouldn't magically fix the Clippers' problems, because Paul wasn't the main cause of those problems. The poor record came from injuries, roster-building failures, coaching changes that weren't working, and stars who weren't playing at championship levels. Paul's crime in the organization's eyes was pointing all of this out too loudly and too stubbornly. Lue also showed real sadness about how things ended. "Do I want to see CP go out like this? No. I have a lot of respect for him. He's been a friend of mine over the years. You never want to see a great go out like this, but I'm pretty sure he will find something because he's a great player." The coaching staff's choice to let Paul go clearly weighed on Lue, even as he defended the organizational decision. The players' reactions right after Paul left showed just how split the locker room had become. James Harden, who had been accidentally caught in the middle of this story through the hot microphone event, showed confusion and shock. "I'm just as confused and shocked as you guys. It's a lot that we were dealing with." Harden's carefully chosen words, "a lot that we were dealing with," suggested levels of problems beyond just the Paul situation, hinting at bigger organizational issues that weren't being talked about publicly. Kawhi Leonard, usually quiet in his public comments, called the decision to let Paul go shocking, and noted that he'd had good conversations with Paul before the split. Leonard's reaction showed how sudden and unexpected this decision seemed, even to the team's franchise star. Lue later admitted that the locker room was affected by Paul's leaving. "The guys were not happy about it. It's a guy they also go to war with every single day." This creates an interesting puzzle. If the players were unhappy about losing Paul, and if management wasn't blaming him for the losses, why was he let go? The answer seems to point to a coaching staff and front office that felt they'd lost control of the locker room story and needed to show their power again, even at the cost of a respected veteran. Kendrick Perkins gave perhaps the most damaging inside view on his podcast, essentially agreeing with the Clippers while admitting the messy truth of the situation. Perkins told that Paul had received many warnings about his behavior, including specific times where Paul disagreed with coaching instructions during timeouts, leading to on-court confusion and mistakes. One especially telling story involved Paul advising players to ignore what assistant coaches had just told them, effectively running a separate coaching operation. "CP3 ain't no saint," Perkins said bluntly. Based on talks with Paul's former teammates, Perkins painted a picture of a player whose intense leadership style had become too much for veterans and coaching staff alike. He noted that while Paul's way might work with younger, more impressionable players, older veterans found his voice too loud and his constant criticisms tiring. Importantly, Perkins explained that it would take a lot to push Ty Lue to the breaking point. "We all know Lue. We all know that it got to be a certain level for him to get to the point where he's not speaking to you." This background suggests that whatever happened between Paul and Lue wasn't just about one or two arguments, but rather a continuing pattern of behavior that finally went beyond even Lue's considerable patience. Divided opinions and lasting questions. The aftermath of Chris Paul's leaving the Clippers has shown a fascinating split in how different people see leadership, responsibility, and organizational culture in the modern NBA. Nowhere is this split more clear than in the different views given by Kendrick Perkins and Blake Griffin, two former players with very different relationships to the Chris Paul story. Blake Griffin, Paul's former teammate during his first Clippers time, didn't hold back in his criticism of how the organization handled the situation. Talking on NBA on Prime, Griffin showed deep disappointment in the Clippers organization, specifically calling out the lack of direct talk from key people. "I'm disappointed in the Clippers organization. No communication with Ty Lue, and even more than that, no communication from Steve Ballmer." Griffin's criticism goes beyond just the Paul situation. It speaks to a bigger pattern of poor communication within the Clippers organization. For a veteran player with deep ties to the team, being let go in the middle of the night without direct talks with the head coach or team owner struck Griffin as basically disrespectful. He praised Paul for teaching professionalism and taking games seriously, qualities that should have earned better treatment no matter how the basketball relationship had gone bad. Griffin's view raises uncomfortable questions for the Clippers. If you bring in a respected veteran to teach your team and serve as an extra part of the coaching staff, what does it say about your organization when you can't effectively talk about expectations and limits? Why didn't Lue or Ballmer sit down with Paul weeks earlier to talk about these issues before they reached a point that couldn't be fixed? The silence from leadership says a lot about an organization that may be more comfortable avoiding hard conversations than having them. Meanwhile, Perkins took a different angle, supporting the Clippers' decision while calling for responsibility at the executive level. Though he wanted team president Lawrence Frank fired, Perkins insisted that Paul was responsible for the breakdown. His reasoning was simple. Championship teams can't have players working against coaches, no matter how accomplished those players might be. Even legends need to respect the chain of command. And Paul, according to Perkins's sources, repeatedly crossed that line. The debate between these views, Griffin's focus on organizational communication failures versus Perkins's stress on player responsibility within existing power structures, captures the bigger conversation happening across NBA circles. Is this a story about a messed-up organization using a player as an excuse who dared to demand excellence? Or is it about a veteran whose methods, however well-meant, became unhelpful in a specific situation? What makes this situation especially complex is Chris Paul's history. This isn't the first time questions have been raised about Paul's leadership style creating friction. During his first time with the Clippers and later with the Houston Rockets, similar worries came up about Paul being a difficult teammate whose intensity could push people away rather than inspire them. Yet, Paul has also been given credit for helping develop young players like Devin Booker and Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, serving as a teacher who raised their games and their professional approach. The pattern suggests that Paul's effectiveness as a leader depends heavily on the situation. Younger players looking for guidance, seem to do well under his teaching, while teams with many veterans and established stars may find his approach annoying. But 2025 to 2026 Clippers, with an older roster that included 37-year-old James Harden, 37-year-old Brook Lopez, and 34-year-old Kawhi Leonard, fell right into the second category. But we can't ignore the big, obvious problem. The Clippers' continued struggles after Paul left. The team's 5-16 start is one of the worst in team history. And while they've shown small improvement in some games, the basic issues remain. The offense is stuck. The defense is weak. Injuries keep piling up, and questions about coaching and roster building continue. If removing Paul was supposed to bring back harmony and improve performance, the results have been disappointing at best. Lawrence Frank admitted these bigger organizational failures, taking ownership of the team's poor play. We're all part of the problem. It starts at the top with me. Frank admitted the team was playing bad basketball on many fronts, from offense to defense to overall execution. His willingness to accept responsibility is good, but it also raises the question, if the problems start at the top, why was a 14-minute-per-game backup point guard the one sent home? The roster-building problems are glaring looking back. The decision to trade away Norman Powell, the heavy reliance on injury-prone veterans, the getting of players like Bradley Beal, who immediately had season-ending surgery, and the failure to develop depth, all point to front-office mistakes that no amount of veteran leadership could fix. Paul's crime might have been pointing out these failures too loudly and too publicly. Social media watchers and basketball analysts have noted poison in that locker room that goes beyond just the Paul situation. The descriptions range from player versus player fights to player versus coach tensions to bigger cultural issues within the organization. Some have suggested that the Clippers culture basically fights against being responsible, preferring comfortable average performance to the hard work of facing uncomfortable truths. As the December 15th trade deadline gets closer, the Clippers face important decisions about their future. Do they make big roster moves to save the season? Do they think about coaching changes if the struggles continue? Do they break it all up and commit to starting over? The Paul situation has only made the urgency of these questions stronger, while at the same time showing how unprepared the organization seems to be to answer them. For Chris Paul, the future remains unsure. Reports suggest he's thinking about retiring after this season, possibly ending a Hall of Fame career on this bad note. Whether another team takes a chance on him likely depends on how the basketball world understands this Clippers story. Is he a locker room problem who can't live with other veterans? Or is he a proven winner who demands excellence and simply landed in a messed-up situation? The truth, as is often the case, probably contains parts of both stories. Paul's leadership style is undeniably intense and uncompromising. He doesn't accept average performance gladly. He questions authority when he thinks it's necessary, and he holds everyone to extremely high standards. These qualities can be changing in the right environment with the right people. In the wrong situation with resistant veterans, a struggling coaching staff, and an organization that may not be ready to face its deeper issues, those same qualities become disruptive. What's perhaps most interesting about this whole story is how it's shown the weakness of NBA locker room dynamics in the modern time. The league has become more and more focused on player power, star player comfort, and avoiding conflict at almost any cost. Load management, player-driven team building, and the general catering to superstar wants have become standard practice. Into this environment walks Chris Paul, an old-school player who doesn't believe in load management, who thinks veterans should play through discomfort, and who believes that being responsible matters more than feelings. The crash was perhaps unavoidable. The Clippers, despite their championship hopes and billionaire owner, have never been able to fully shake their reputation as an organization that struggles with culture and leadership. The Chris Paul situation is just the newest part in a long history of the team being unable to make the most of its talent because of internal problems. Old footage and social media posts have added extra layers to the story, including clips of heated locker room arguments and even a TikTok video showing Paul talking to Ty Lue's girlfriend, going quiet when Lue arrived. Though these events lack big reveals about the core issues and sometimes feel more like gossip than meaningful insight, what we're left with is a warning story about communication, leadership, organizational culture, and the challenges of managing strong personalities in high-pressure situations. The Clippers made a choice to put short-term peace over possibly uncomfortable but needed responsibility. Time will tell whether that choice helps them save their season or whether it simply let them avoid facing problems that will continue to trouble them. For James Harden, his accidental role in showing these problems through that hot microphone moment and his passing on of Paul's suggestion will be a small part of his career, but it's a revealing one. It showed a player trying to move between respecting a veteran teammate and supporting his coach, finally landing on the side of authority. Whether that was the right choice depends entirely on which story you believe about what was really happening in that Clippers locker room. As for Ty Lue, he's denied giving Paul the silent treatment, defended his coaching way, and shown regret about how things ended while maintaining it was necessary. He's insisted the decision was organizational rather than personal, even as he's admitted that communication broke down to a point that couldn't be fixed. Lue's final comments on the situation perhaps best capture its complexity. It just didn't work out the way anyone hoped, and now everyone involved has to live with the results. The Chris Paul Clippers story will be studied for years as an example of what happens when good intentions, strong personalities, organizational problems, and poor performance all crash. There are no clear heroes or bad guys in this story, just imperfect people and systems trying to handle impossible situations under intense pressure and close watching. What James Harden showed, perhaps without meaning to, was that sometimes the search for championship excellence requires facing uncomfortable truths. And sometimes organizations would rather send the truth teller home in the middle of the night than look at themselves. Press that subscribe button, turn on notifications so you never miss a video, and share this with others.